I've done videos on this in the past, but this topic has come up again, so I'll address it as many times as is needed. What I want to talk with you about are birthdays. There are two places in the Bible where birthdays are mentioned, and in those two places, what they are talking about are kings that were celebrating their birthday. But there's no judgment regarding birthdays in the Bible. So there are a lot of narratives regarding birthdays that the Bible does not indicate, and we're not supposed to be adding to the scroll. And so when you start going to historians and outside sources to tell you whether something is right or wrong, or to tell you what the history is, you have to be really careful. You have to take the time to discern that with God. And to be very honest, God does not allow me to go to outside sources very often, and when he does, I have to exercise extreme scrutiny. And in fact, last night I went to an outside source to help me to understand some things about the moon, and God handed me over to deception. He let me be deceived for about an hour, then he moved me to understand why that theory could not fit. Please just be very, very attuned to God. If you're not, there are going to be problems. So I'm going to read the message that this person sent for the benefit of all. Carrie, ever since you did the video about the mistranslation in the NIV regarding Lot's children and birthdays, yes, by the way, the translators translate that to birthdays. It's not birthdays. It just made me wonder why Pharaoh and Herod were the only birthdays mentioned, and I wondered if it had anything to do with them being kings. So when Naomi asked about it, I was thinking about that again. When I looked into whether there was a significance to kings and birthdays, I discovered that birthdays originated in ancient Egypt. Okay, birthdays did not originate in ancient Egypt. Birthdays originated when God formed a baby in his mother's womb, and then that baby came to birth. It is the day of delivery. What originated in Egypt is some pagan way of observing that day. When I published the book, A Soul Aligned, I went online to Google it because I wanted to see where it popped up. And what came up were a bunch of occult videos, occult articles on the soul. So what the occult has done with the soul, with the word soul and the alignment of the soul, is they've done something pagan with it. Well, I don't talk about anything pagan. I stand on the word of God and I talk about the fact that we need to be conformed, aligned to God. If you want to be well, if you want to heal, that's what you need to do. You need to be aligned with God. Does that mean I should change the title of the book? Does that mean that the occult has coveted the soul? Because last I checked, God was the author of the soul. He's the one who formed man from the dust and breathed life into his nostrils, and he became a living soul. He's the one who said, don't become conformed to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You are to become conformed, aligned to God. Am I going to let them have that? No, I'm not. They can try to covet it all day, but everything belongs to God. And they can't take away the joy and rejoicing that happens when a baby is brought to delivery. They can't take away the fact that we're going to mark that every single year, and we're going to remember that God brought our precious children to delivery and performed that incredible miracle. Are we going to celebrate it as pagans? No, but we're allowed to celebrate, guys. We're allowed to rejoice. And in fact, in the book of Esther, it says that Jews took it upon themselves to establish a day of celebration for what God had done. Esther 9, verse 20, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Gifts are not pagan, guys. Blowing out candles and saying, make a wish, that's pagan. We don't make wishes. We make petitions of God. And then we check ourselves to make sure that we're in his favor and that we even have a right to go and bring that petition before him. It is not pagan to celebrate what God has done. It is pagan to do things that I used to do years ago which was make that day all about me, go out, get drunk, go dancing. I mean, if that's what you're going to do, then what you're doing is engaging in pagan behavior. It's not pagan behavior because it's your birthday. It's pagan behavior because you're acting like a pagan. Whether the kings in the Bible or Pharaoh in the Bible observed a birthday does not inherently make that evil. The Bible would have to give some sort of a judgment on that in order for us to understand that this is evil. There would have to be some indication of that. Nevertheless, the way that they observed was probably pagan. It probably was not correct because they didn't believe in God and they weren't celebrating to him. My grandson, Jeremiah, we didn't know if my grandson was going to make it. I participated in the delivery of my grandson. Do you think that I'm going to celebrate his birthday coming up in a pagan way? Or do you think that I'm going to remember what God did, the miracle that he did forever and ever, and I'm going to rejoice, tell my grandson that story, glorify God? Does God not want us to do that? Has he not established holy days in order for us to remember what God has done? Well, yes, I'm going to continue to celebrate what God did in the birth of my grandson, and I'm certainly not going to let anyone tell me that a day of birth is pagan. God established a day of birth. We didn't just show up. So no, this is incorrect. Egyptians did not discover birthdays. Here's what happens when you start going to the internet. You start going to external sources. You need to sit with God. And so I advise you guys not to go there at all until you have learned how to sit with God. God showed me quickly that what I had discovered or thought I had discovered was incorrect. And the reason he showed it to me quickly is because I go to him first and I ask him to help me discern. And then I go to him again after I think that I've gotten an answer and he shows me. But when you start going to external sources and you set that up in your heart to be the authority, you're going to be deceived. You're also probably going to lose common sense because birthdays are not discovered by pagans. Birthdays are established by God. It doesn't matter what pagans do. They don't have the ability to covet what God has established. And he established a day of birth. People rejoice on a day of birth. Abraham gave a celebration when Isaac was weaned. He gave a feast. Is that somehow different from a birthday, guys? You're allowed to rejoice. You're allowed to mark special events. Celebrate him to God. Celebrate the fact that a loved one joined your family. Is that wrong? Is it wrong that I've enjoyed the last year of having this blessing of my grandson? Does God not tell us that our children are blessings? And should I not celebrate that? I mean, this is just silly. So she goes on to say the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was transformed into a god on that day. They regarded that birth as more important than the earthly one. Could that be why the Bible references years by the reign of kings? Guys, you need to be careful about making these assumptions. That is an assumption. The Bible does not give us any indication as to why it's referencing years by the reign of kings. The Bible also says so-and-so was this many years old when they began to reign. If the Bible's not giving you any indication, this is the danger in bringing in external information because now you're trying to put together a narrative that God has not said. Okay, she goes on to say some other things that are clearly from the authority of the world, clearly regarding pagan ways of observing birthdays. I'm not going to get into it because, for the reasons that I've said to you. Whatever the pagans are doing in order to drum up a narrative about what soul alignment means, it doesn't change the facts. It doesn't change the author. It does not give them authority. She says, this may not change anything, but I wondered about the kings. I do still agree with what you say regarding not celebrating as the pagans do, as we've established that candles are pagan as well. I do think that Tori made a good point regarding the gifts to Jesus. Those were in homage to the Messiah. So the question was, when the Magi brought these gifts to Jesus, were they doing it in worship of Jesus, or were they doing it in celebration of his birth? The word tells us that they wanted to go find Jesus to worship him. Gifts are brought. in sacrifice, offering, and worship. So we can't take that isolated situation and say, okay, gifts are okay. I don't know where gifts became this evil thing, because a lot of people have tried to come on the channel and tell me that it's evil. Oh, you're celebrating to self. You're not allowed to give gifts. Gifts are not evil, guys. Don't be excessive. Don't be like the pagans. Gifts are mentioned throughout the Bible. If you receive a gift, is that going to take away from you acknowledging God, worshiping God, glorifying God, celebrating to Him? If you are happy in your heart about a new addition to your family and the fact that my daughter and my grandson, that they made it, that they were healthy, am I allowed to both be happy about that and to glorify God? Yeah, they go hand in hand. If you're truly grateful to God, this is going to go hand in hand. It's not mutually exclusive. I'm allowed to rejoice. I'm allowed to celebrate. I'm allowed to give gifts. Doesn't God say, if you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, will God not also give good gifts to His children? There's an acknowledgement that there are gifts being given in the Bible. Genesis 24:53. Then the servant brought out gold and silver jewelry and articles of clothing and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave costly gifts to her brother and to her mother. Genesis 32:20. And be sure to say, your servant Jacob is coming behind us, for he thought, I will pacify him with these gifts I'm sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me. Another thing that she mentioned is Ecclesiastes 7:1. It says that one's day of death is better than his day of birth. Yeah, it doesn't negate his day of birth. Your day of death is better than your day of birth. You're closer to going to God. You've gotten out of this evil world. Being born into this world is sort of bittersweet, isn't it? Everyone's rejoicing over this life, but then, I mean, if you guys think about this, have you not also thought, my gosh, they're born into this world. They're going to have to experience this world. They're going to need to be protected and sheltered from this world. The other thing mentioned is Job 3:1. Job curses his day of birth, and so does Jeremiah in 2014. Guys, come on. This is getting ridiculous. This needs to be looked at in context. Jeremiah was suffering as a prophet. Job was suffering because of the judgment that God brought on him. They're cursing their day of birth because of that. You ever been through something so bad that you thought, I wish I were never born? That's the context. The context is not that the day of birth is a bad thing to be loathed. All throughout the Bible, people are praying for babies. They're excited about their babies coming into the world. They're excited about this blessing that they're receiving from God. That's how the Bible talks about babies and birth. Even talking about your delivery and likening it to birth. Your deliverance. So let's not be foolish. This question, these thoughts need to be brought to God, and it is clear that these thoughts were not brought to God. I'm just going to say it like that, because if I don't, you're not going to hear it. You're going to think that it's okay for you to keep going to the internet to research these things and then sprinkle in scripture. That is clear that that's what was done here. It's clear that this is being processed carnally. You need to get deeper. You need to be authentic and attuned to God and let God move you, rather than trying to process this carnally. I am not saying this to hurt your feelings, but I'm saying it to confront you about this. That's what I'm seeing in your process, is that you are processing this in your carnality. You haven't gone to God. You did not receive these things from Him. Please go discern that with God and ask Him what you need to do instead. I would recommend that while you're doing that you stay off the internet, commentaries, YouTube. Isolate yourself with His Spirit, because you need to learn how to discern, and that His Spirit is enough to give you the answers that you're seeking. The last thing I want to say is, for anyone saying that this is not a God-ordained day, that is absurd. God knows exactly when you're going to be born, at what time you're going to be born. He wove you in your mother's womb. It most certainly is a God-ordained day of birth. Who else ordained it? We're still trying to discern God's calendar and get that nailed down. It's clear in the Bible that there are 360 days on God's calendar, but we're trying to understand how that works with a month and how we need to go ahead and map that out. When that happens, then you can actually use God's calendar in order to calculate your day of birth. rather than using the Gregorian calendar, which obviously would not please God. But your day of birth has been ordained by God. He doesn't need to make it a feast day in order for you to understand that. Please discern this message with God.